So here we have a model of the integument. And we can see the layers that it's divided into. We can see the epidermis here, which is this part that sits on top. And we can immediately see that we have a difference in thin skin right here versus thick skin, which is over here. We can see that not only is thick skin thicker in the outermost layer, but we also have this extra layer of cells in thick skin. So if we go from superficial to deep, we encounter the stratum corneum first, that hard horn layer that's full of cross-linked keratin. Below that, in thick skin only, we have the single layer of cells called the stratum lucidum, which means the clear layer. Below that, we have the stratum granulosum, which are, in this model, these elliptical cells. And then below that, we have the stratum spinosum, which contains the spiny cells. This is where keratin production really begins, is in the spiny layer, and really kicks into high gear in the granular layer, or the stratum granulosum. At the base of all this, we have the stratum basale, also known as the stratum germinativum, because this is where we have our stem cells that are dividing. That's this dark blue here. And this is sitting on a basement membrane. And the basement membrane is the interface between the stratum germinativum and the underlying dermis. Now here, they've taken away the epidermis so that we can see the dermal papillae a little bit better. And if we were to look down on this model, we would see these mounds. It has a sort of an egg crate, egg carton appearance with these wavy undulating mounds. Now, we can see that the waviness of the basement membrane and the stratum germinativum follow these mounds. And that waviness is called the epidermal ridges. So when we look at them, in some cases, the epidermal ridges, especially on the palms of the hands, the soles of the feet, will give rise to fingerprints and toe prints on the surface of the skin. So once we have seen the stratified squamous epithelium that comprises our epidermis, we can look at the dermis. And the dermis, here in orange, comprises the papillary layer. And the papillary layer on this model, you can see it as this plexus, if you will, of blood vessels that basically end in capillaries in these dermal papillae. And the papillary layer is defined from about here, and then they didn't continue the blood vessels on this side of the model, but you can imagine that they would continue on through the skin. And this is about the extent or the limit of the papillary layer. Below these blood vessels, we have the reticular layer. And you can see this is where we have a lot of our deep structures, our accessory structures originating. So we can look at several of these, including our hair follicles here. And hair follicles often have these sebaceous glands associated with them. This is one in 3 dimensions. Here's one that's been cut through longitudinally. So you can see inside the sebaceous gland, and you can also see inside the hair follicle, you can see the hair. And here we have the hair bulb, the hair root, and then we have the shaft of the hair that projects through the epidermis. We can also see that we have a muscle, a smooth muscle associated with this hair follicle. This is called an erector pili muscle, and that is what causes the hairs to stand on end. So if somebody gets cold or they get frightened, the hair will stand up on end. And this, in other animals, has a lot of value because when hair stands up on end, it creates an insulating layer. That's one reason. And another reason that the hair will stand up on end when you're frightened is if you look at animals like cats, when they are confronted, they usually, what do? They arch their backs and their hair stands on end. And this is to make them look bigger so that a potential predator or a potential confrontation could be avoided with another animal because it might be a little bit scarier to be bigger. So those are 2 functions of the erector pili muscles. And these are smooth muscles associated with hair follicles. Now, we can see a lot of vasculature in here. So we also have what is called a cutaneous plexus. And that's basically a bunch of blood vessels. And here we see them in cross-section coming out of the model towards you. So we can see these blood vessels that are distributed throughout right at the border between the dermis and hypodermis. Some of these blood vessels give rise to what will become the papillary, and some texts call it the subpapillary plexus. That's these vessels here that have their capillaries in the dermal papillae. Now, let's look at some of these other structures within the reticular layer. Here we have a sweat gland, and this is a sudoriferous sweat gland or a merocrine sweat gland. And this gives rise to the watery sweat that we have with sensible perspiration. That is what we have when we're exercising or when we get hot. So a lot of these glands, you'll find them all over the body. There's another type of sweat gland not shown here called an apocrine sweat gland, and those are found in the groin and the armpit area in humans. Here we can see a merocrine sweat gland that has been cut through longitudinally, so you can see inside, and you can see it's this coiled tubular structure. You could see the coiled tubes inside, and then of course we have the duct that empties out onto the surface of the skin. Now we can also see some of these things. This is nervous tissue right here. So this is what's going to relay the signal from some of our sensory structures in the skin. Like this right here is a tactile corpuscle, also known as a Meissner's corpuscle, that is found in the dermal papillae. And I'm not going to make you memorize that or know that, but just be aware that you have a lot of sensory structures within the skin. Here's another sensory structure that's deep, and this is called a lamellated corpuscle because it has these lamellae or layers. And this is very good for sensing deep pressure or vibration and so forth. Now, notice that we have the division of the papillary layer by this papillary plexus and the reticular layer. And remember that we have within the reticular layer our dense, irregular connective tissues. And this is also the layer which gives rise to most of our accessory structures. The border between the reticular layer and the subcutaneous is not that well defined. You can see that there's it's a diffuse border, and we see that the vasculature is right along the edge of the border between the reticular layer and the hypodermis, also known as the subcutaneous. And as we remember, the hypodermis is not actually part of the integument, but it is that connective tissue layer that is sometimes called the superficial fascia that directly underlie the cutaneous membrane. So we remember that our cutaneous membrane is our epidermis and our dermis. And our cutaneous membrane is one of two parts of our integument. The other part of the integument are these accessory structures that originate within the dermis. So when we look at the hypodermis, we see that it has mostly adipose tissue and some areolar connective tissues. And this is what's going to allow your skin basically to slide over the underlying structures such as muscles. And so if you flex your muscle, for example, when you flex your muscle, the skin has to stretch over it and be able to move. So these things have to move independently. And this is one of the primary purposes of the hypodermis. But of course, we see it has a lot of adipose tissue. So it can also insulate, because adipose tissue is a very good insulator against cold. So because these are fat cells, these are very good for insulation, and you can have some energy storage in here as well. In fact, there are some populations that live in very cold climates, such as the Inuits and the Aleutians. They tend to have a little bit more subcutaneous fat because they need that extra insulation against the cold weather. Another group of people that have a little bit extra adipose in the subcutaneous are distance open water swimmers. So these are people who swim in very cold water. And this adipose tissue gives them two advantages. One, it's insulating against the cold water, but another reason is that the adipose tissue itself is less dense than water. So it gives them a little bit more buoyancy as well.